Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Kris. This is How Did Russia Become an Empire? A Great Northern War documentary. It's been a while. It's been a couple weeks, I think, since I've released one of these. And I kind of forgot. I remembered that I had to record them, but I'm just doing so many other things that I just forgot to get back to it. So I think this is like, let's see, 1 and 2... 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So this is number 10. I'm going to do this one, and then that one. It's going to be 15 minutes. So let's just go ahead and jump into it now. I'll try to remember to put a link in the description for the previous one that I've done, but don't take my word for it because I forget.
Men. The main Swedish force arrived at Bereza-Sapieska on the 25th of June and immediately started working on crossing the rivers and marshes in front of them. By the time Goltz realized what was happening, Charles was already halfway to Mahilov. Utterly surprised by the speed at which the Swedish army crossed such difficult terrain, Sheremetev and Menshikov left to form a defensive line at Holovchin, 24 kilometers away from Mahilov. Charles arrived near the town of Holovchin on the 10th of July. There he met a strong Russian cavalry force, which he did not yet have enough men to engage in a direct battle. The cavalry retreated slowly across the river. Because of the thick forests that surrounded the town, the majority of the Swedish army arrived only later that day. There was very little action in the next couple of days, as the Swedes waited for all of their units to arrive, while the Russian army was fortifying its position. Those fortifications were completed on the 13th. Trenches ran down the river and edge of the forest for several kilometers, and many artillery batteries were placed along those lines, along with a chevaux de frise. The Russian army was led by fierce rivals Menshikov and Sheremetev, as well as Repnin. They had around 30,000 men on their side. The Swedish army, led by Charles, consisted of 12 to 13,000 men, together with 28 artillery pieces. The Russian army was spread over the entire length of the trenches. However, the parts of the army that were under the command of different generals had barely any communication with each other. At 1:30 at night, the Swedish artillery, which was placed on a hill, started firing on the Russian positions under Repnin. Afterwards, the Swedish army started crossing the Vabik River, with Charles being again the first to enter the water. The Russian soldiers could not fight the Swedish crossing due to relentless artillery fire. As each unit crossed, they started engaging the Russians in battle, forcing a large part of Repnin's forces to retreat to the forest behind them. A part of the Swedish infantry wheeled to the left after crossing, thereby cutting off Repnin from the rest of the Russian army. The Russian infantry passed over their own trenches to reach the marshland. This led to them getting separated from the cavalry along the trenches, which were afterwards quickly routed. Once the Swedish forces reached the forest where the Russian infantry retreated, they came under heavy fire. At that point, Charles rode to every infantry battalion and urged them to fight the Russians with pikes and swords, rather than fire at them. They subsequently charged the Russian forces in the forest and quickly defeated them in hand-to-hand combat. By that time, it was already too late for the rest of the Russian army to offer any assistance, so they retreated to Shklov. The Swedish forces lost
Strongholds in the enemy have been defeated. Victory of the battle. Okay.
only around 250 men, while the Russians suffered some 2,000 casualties. As the Russian commanders didn't expect Charles to attack such a difficult position, effectively only a third of the Russian army actually participated in the battle. Charles decisively defeated the disorganized Russian army at the Battle of Holovchin. However, the majority of the soldiers and generals escaped unharmed to Smolensk. The bridges across the Dnieper were burned during the retreat. The Swedish soldiers were exhausted from the forced marching, food shortages, and bad weather, so they could not build new bridges for a month. After crossing the Dnieper, it became evident that the Russian forces had extensively employed scorched earth tactics. The area between Mahilov and Smolensk was completely devastated, with peasants fleeing with their cattle into the forests and leaving neither crops, tools, nor any other kind of supplies for the Swedes. Additionally, the Russian army burned down almost all buildings, leaving no sturdy shelter from the worsening weather. Seeing a direct advance towards Moscow as suicide, the Swedish command reviewed their possible options. As Charles refused to advance into Russia in the aftermath of the Battle of Narva, it came as a surprise to many that he chose to do so now. A variety of factors contributed to his decision. His belief that Ruthenia was a prosperous and resource-rich land, that the Ukrainians wanted to rebel against the Russians, and that he could expect aid from the Cossacks and Crimean Tatars. Meanwhile, a Polish army advanced into Ruthenia as well. The hetman of the Zaporozhian Cossacks, Ivan Mazepa, was worried at this confluence of several large armies into his land.
Sir Ivan says that as a young man he was caught in an affair with a noble woman whose husband punished him by tying him naked to a wild horse and setting it free. Eventually he reached the Cossacks and became their military leader. I just did a video and that story sounds familiar. Oh man. That's gonna...
He asked Peter for military support. However, the Tsar refused, content to just shadow the Swedish army during its march. Mazepa saw this as a betrayal of a treaty between the Cossacks and Russia, and promptly allied with the Poles and the Swedes. The Russians retaliated quickly, seizing the Zaporozhian capital of Baturin, massacring all of its inhabitants and allegedly tying them to crosses and floating them down the Dnieper. The Russian army also continuously employed scorched earth tactics, depleting the land of anything useful. Trying to avoid further Russian reprisals, the Zaporozhians replaced Mazepa with a new hetman and continued fighting on the Russian side. The Swedish army, once again low on supplies, was eager for the arrival of the support army. Lewenhaupt's support army was supposed to meet the main army at Mahilov in August. With significantly fewer men and resources than planned, they nonetheless managed to leave Riga in July. Due to bad weather, they fell significantly behind the main army. Peter was aware that Charles was expecting a relief force, which put Lewenhaupt's army at great risk as soon as they were discovered. His army crossed the Dnieper River on the 2nd or 3rd of October. Russian troops started harassing them as soon as the 6th. On the 9th, the support army was merely 10 kilometers away from Slavhorod, Propoysk, where they planned to cross the Sos. It was at that point, near the village of Lesnaya, that a large Russian army started attacking them. Because of previous raids and rumors that Russian troops had already taken Propoysk, Lewenhaupt arrayed his support army defensively. 700 infantry and cavalry were placed at the front, followed by half the baggage. They were followed by several cavalry units, behind which was the rest of the baggage train. The remaining soldiers were placed at the edge of the forest in order to prevent any attacks. In total, Lewenhaupt had between 12,000 and 13,000 soldiers at his disposal, along with 16 artillery pieces. Not all of them would participate in the battle though, as about a quarter were posted to defend the baggage train. The Russian army was led by Peter himself, though he had some of his most competent generals there also. Besides the 1,000 men which took Propoysk, the Russian army numbered between 26,000 and 28,000 men, together with a massive number of cannons, possibly around 100. The battle started when the 700 Swedish soldiers in the front came under fire from the 1,000 Russian soldiers that took Propoysk. The main Russian army, on the other hand, advanced in 2 columns towards the Swedish positions, with the main goal being to take the clearing in the forest and the bridge over the Lesnyanka stream. Menshikhov's 7,000-strong column reached the forest clearing. However, they were quickly pushed back by 900 Swedes using their famous Karolian shock tactics. Hearing the gunfire, another Swedish regiment marched towards the gunfire, causing confusion within the two groups. Those regiments suffered some losses and were forced to retreat. Peter's and Menshikoff's columns joined up at a crossroads near the Lesnyanka River, where they were met by 2,000 Swedes under Steckelberg. After his position was reinforced by another 2,500 men, Steckelberg's troops started pushing Peter's column back, even capturing some of their guns. It was only the elite Russian guards that held the line and prevented a complete rout. The Russians were much more successful in their other column. Menshikov's flanking maneuver managed to completely push the Swedes out of the forest clearing. Steckelberg subsequently ordered a retreat towards Lesnaya, leaving the Russians in control of the forest. Lewenhaupt attempted a counterattack to regain control, though he was unsuccessful. The fighting subsequently transferred to the fields outside Lesnaya. After a pause in the fighting, at 4 p.m. the armies started battling again. A newly arrived Russian cavalry force under Bauer charged the Swedish lines. As Karelian tactics excel in open terrain, Bauer was pushed back. In the next couple of hours, the Swedes killed many Russian soldiers. However, the sheer size of the Russian army ensured that they would suffer quite a few casualties too. Over time, they were pushed closer and closer to Lesnaya, leaving the bridge over the Lesnyanka exposed to Russian attacks. Just as the Swedish army was on the brink of defeat, the 700 soldiers that were at the front of the baggage train arrived and repulsed the Russian forces at the bridge. With their arrival, the United Swedish Army fought even more aggressively and managed to push the Russian army back. At 7 p.m, the battle stopped. The Russians retreated to the forest to recuperate, while the Swedes stood in battle formation for several hours still, expecting a night attack. The attack never came though. Not wanting to waste time, Lewenhaupt ordered the army to assemble and to start marching towards the Soz at once. With the carriages and artillery being a much greater burden with so many fewer men, the general ordered the guns to be sunk in the marshes. By the time they reached Propoysk, the Russians had already put the town to the torch. Expecting an enemy attack at any moment, Lewenhaupt later ordered that all of the baggage which cannot be carried across the river should be burned or left behind. The soldiers used this opportune moment to indulge in food and drink. Many of them would wander drunk into the forest and marshes, never to be seen again.
Oh my goodness.
In the end, the Russians lost about 7,000 men in the Battle of Lesnaya, while the Swedes lost around 3,000. On the other hand, Lewenhaupt lost many more men at Propoysk to fear and alcohol. Only half of the men.
The results of the battle aftermath was disastrous for the Swedes and in strategical manner. It was the first time Russian army managed to defeat the Swedes in a major battle. Oh, okay. And that's why they got drunk then? Okay, that makes sense.
And very few provisions ended up crossing the Soz in the end. The small force which did reach Charles was nowhere near as strong as he had hoped. Moreover, the winter of 1708 to 1709 was one of the coldest on record. This, together with the scorched earth tactics, left the Swedish army in a disastrous state. Thousands of soldiers starved to death or succumbed to disease, and many simply froze to death. The Russians suffered many casualties during winter as well, though nowhere near as many as the Swedes. At the approach of spring, Charles was left with less than half of the men that he had started the campaign with. The great Cossack rebellion which he expected did not materialize. Mazeppa promised tens of thousands of soldiers for the upcoming battles against the Russians, yet the number that he could realistically muster was much smaller than that. Charles's last hope was Stanisław. The Polish and Swedish forces kept regular lines of communication during their advance into Ruthenia. Since correspondence between the two forces stopped during winter, Charles assumed that the weather simply bogged down his allies' army. The reality of the situation turned out to be far more disheartening. Stanisław's armies retreated into Poland to consolidate power, and due to a miscommunication between himself and his commanders, nobody informed Charles that he was left alone. In the end, it was one of his own envoys to the Ottoman Empire that informed the Swedish king of Stanisław's position. Unable to advance or retreat, Charles saw only one option for his army's survival. He needed to capture a well-provisioned fort and wait until support arrived. On the 1st of May 1709, the Swedish army besieged the port of Poltava, some 300 kilometers east of Kiev. The Swedes could have taken the fort easily by force, however Charles did not want to risk any unnecessary damage to the defences or the grain stores. Peter saw this moment as critical. He advanced towards Poltava from northern Ruthenia and ordered most of his senior generals to assemble there with their troops. By June 15th, the entire Russian army had arrived on the east bank of the Vorskla River. Peter's primary objective was to cross the river with his army. To divert the attention of the Swedes, he sent some cavalry to feign a crossing south of Poltava. Charles then rode out of his camp to see what was happening. What occurred next was one of those minor chance events that sometimes decides the fate of nations. The Swedish king was shot in the foot by a Cossack and refused to have the wound tended to until he nearly fell unconscious. To make matters worse, this took place on June 17th, his birthday, a bad omen which further demoralized the Swedish troops. While Charles was weakened by fever, his generals could not agree on the response against the Russians. Peter used this opportunity to cross the river and set up camp north of Poltava. The camp was fortified afterwards, and a series of redoubts were built. To the rear, the Russian position.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop it here. Yeah, get shot in the foot, man. The infection, unless you're going to get that amputated, and you're going to do it quickly, that's a wrap. That's life. Okay. Well, I'm going to end this here. Sorry, just kind of moving ahead. All right, I'm going to end this here. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, or you know what you should do? You should subscribe to my channel and then unsubscribe from somebody else. Teach them a lesson.